what your insurance carrier will pay out regarding flooding, right? Sure. So flooding from outside weather in compared to bursted pipe, they fall under different coverages. Am I correct?
But yeah, and a lot of times when people talk about water damage in their house, my house was flooded because my water heater broke, or a hose to the dishwasher broke and flooded my. That's flooding from inside the house. True flooding, that's really water damage. True flooding, like with Harvey, was rising water from outside the home, and that's not going to be covered by any Texas homeowners, investment property, rental property. You have to have specific flood insurance to cover that type of damage. Yes,
and that's why I brought that up, right? Because we obviously we do loans for properties, and you'll do the insurance for those customers, and sometimes those properties are in zoned flood zones,
floodplain areas. Sure.
Yes, and so that's going to be a separate insurance policy, correct?
Correct.
So that's like Harvey. When you're along the coast, if you're in a flood zone, you're going to have a separate policy for that. So Harvey fell under different coverage than this.
Yeah, and I know we're here to talk about Snowvid, but just to go back to Harvey, that was the tragedy because 80% of the homes that were flooded were in what were considered preferred flood zones that were not required to have flood insurance. So many of those people lost their homes basically because they didn't have flood insurance because there was no requirements to have it. So realistically now, if I'm talking to anybody that's looking to purchase a property in Houston or the Gulf area, even if they're in a preferred flood zone, they should get flood insurance.
Absolutely. And that's something that you can help us, right? So if I call you, we get this question all the time. How do I know if I'm in a flood zone? Real
easy. There's a carrier site we just go to. We just enter the address, and it'll tell us the flood zone.
Right.
And if it's what's called a preferred zone, which is flood zone X, then those rates are set by the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program. They're not variable rates. So those you can say exactly what the cost is going to be. If it's in a standard zone, a flood-prone area, like a zone AE, then the cost of the insurance is going to depend on a flood elevation certificate, which the insured has to have, and that can affect the rates of the insurance drastically depending upon how elevated the house is above the lowest ground floor elevation outside the home. So a lot of people will say, well, what's the average cost? Cannot tell you because it's going to vary so much based on what that elevation certificate says.
And that's something that the buyer or whoever the client would get with the survey?
Correct. And the seller may actually have one.
That link that you said that you used to check, is that public or is that just for insurance?
No, it's just for insurance. Yeah.
Just because if it was public, I would have posted it up. But I usually, for our loans, I'll usually use like FEMA flood maps. Like you can actually do a Google search and find flood maps in your area. Sometimes, like when we're doing loans out in El Paso has their own flood maps. They don't have many flood zones in El Paso, but there are ways. What I was saying is that people can find those areas.
But you also said that 80% of the people that were affected during Harvey didn't have proper coverage, right?
Correct.
So do you think that because Harvey happened, people had better coverage for this, or was this just such a act of God, as we call it, that people had better coverage?
Well, I think they were really kind of talking apples and oranges a little bit because pretty much any homeowner's policy is going to have water damage coverage on it. It's just to what extent. So it's unlikely that a person has homeowner's insurance that doesn't have water damage coverage. So I don't think there's going to be as many people that are going to be out of luck based on that. Now, when we get to the investment property side, there could be some possibilities of folks not being covered if they didn't have the proper type of policy to cover their rental property.
And that's something we talk about with our clients often is like, hey, don't just get the cheapest policy.
No.
Don't just go for the cheapest monthly. So is that do you have you want to talk about anything there where if you're talking directly to your client, it's like, hey, this is why you call me, right? It's this.
What not to cut corners on?
Yeah, and really, when it comes right down to it with investment properties, landlord policies, there are essentially two policy forms. There's a DP1 and a DP3, dwelling policy 1, dwelling policy 3. The dwelling policy 1 is just going to be your cheap, basic, actual cash value policy that's only going to essentially cover the investor for fire and lightning, windstorm, and hail. That's it. There's no water damage coverage on that policy whatsoever, and it's an actual cash value policy. Yes, it's going to be cheap.
Yeah.
But when you have a loss like this, you're going to wish you had paid an extra $100, $200 a year. There's not a gigantic savings by going cheap. I'm sure there are certain investors that have a lot of properties that maybe if they look at an evaluation of their total cost, they may say, okay, I can afford to skimp here because if I have a loss at one property, it's not going to affect me that much. But what if you have losses at 10 properties, which is very possible when you have an event like this? So again, it still goes back to looking for the right coverage, not the cheapest coverage.